I have needlessly but provocatively titled this lecture The Final Solutions to the Indian Problem, Assimilation or Extermination. Whether this analogy is valid or not, I guess we'll know by the end of this lecture. I did this to get your attention and to give you a way to think critically about this information. Final solution, of course, refers to the the German Holocaust of the Jewish people in the Second World War. This is a new lecture, or at least it's a new and improved lecture, so I will be consulting my notes frequently to make sure I stay where I should be. The larger historical context for this discussion is American freedom, something we talked about in our first lecture with American exceptionalism. You'll recall that American freedom is, conceptually, you can view it as something organic, something that expands and contracts. It includes some people some of the time, excludes people other times. You can see that being played out even in this week's news. The Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage is legal in every state. This is an expansion of American freedom. Again, this is an organic, living thing. Here, American freedom is going to both expand and contract, and we'll watch this. Another context for this discussion. We have long-standing dislocated populations both in the West and in the South, and there's going to be attempts by the federal government to solve these problems. The significance, by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the Indian problem has essentially been resolved. Cultures, languages, traditions are essentially doomed by this time. Another significance, and I just referred to this, there are two parallel struggles going on here. In the South, there are millions of new African American freedmen. What are these newly freed slaves going to do? Where are they going to live? How are they going to fit into the Republic? And then, of course, in the West, there are 300,000 or so Native Americans. How are they going to fit into this growing republic? There are federal agencies in both the South and the West attempting to solve these problems. In the South, of course, and we talked about this earlier, you have the Freedmen's Bureau, an attempt to broker labor deals for the newly African Americans, freedmen, education, health care, so on and so forth. In the West, dealing with the Indians, you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We will see in time that both in the South and in the West, African Americans and Indians will be left by the federal government to the mercies of the local state governments. Obstacles for the Indians. The United States government, when it negotiated with the Indians, it tended to want a representative from the Indian tribes or the Indian nations, one representative, who could speak for all the Indians. And this, of course, runs counter to how the Indians govern themselves and how they come to decisions. Indian chieftains tend to make decisions horizontally instead of vertically. In other words, there's a sense of equality among the Indian chieftains where issues are decided in groups and a consensus is arrived at. Here, the negotiating policy of the United States puts the Indians at a disadvantage because the United States government wants one representative to stand for all the Indians, and we'll see this creates conflict within the Indian societies. Oftentimes, these Indian spokesmen are regarded as traitors by their fellow Native Americans. Other obstacles Indians are facing here in the latter part of the 19th century. The buffalo are rapidly disappearing on the upper plains, and the buffalo is the central cultural figure of the Plains Indians, not only for its beef, but for its fur and for its mythological importance. Even Indian burial grounds are being raided, in one case by the Army Medical Museum, looking for skulls and skeletons to display. And of course you have hundreds, if not thousands, of Indians who are starving as their traditional hunting grounds are taken over. You have other obstacles that the Indians have to confront. You got an expanding military presence by the United States Army throughout the West. Forts are being constructed. These are designed to protect the westward expansion of white settlers. You have mining towns emerging. You have railroads being extended westward. And the U.S. military is there to provide protection. U.S. policy towards the Indians tends to fluctuate between pacification on the one hand, that is military activity to put the Indians down, and assimilation on the other hand, an attempt to bring the Indians into white Christian society. This takes us to an old topic in U.S. history regarding Indians and slaves, and that is paternalism. P-A-T, the Latin prefix meaning father. Paternalism, the sense that the white man knows best, not only for African Americans, but for Indians as well. There's a quote here from President Grant. He says, and I quote, "I will favor any course toward the Indians which tends to their civilization and ultimate citizenship." This, of course, is paternalism. And of course, paternalism is also represented by another faction, Christian reformers, sympathetic to the Indians because they see them as potential converts to Christianity. Now, this business between us about assimilation and paternalism, of course, goes back a few centuries. You'll recall this was a major issue during Andrew Jackson's presidency, whether to assimilate the Indians or to expel them. You can read Thomas Jefferson's notes on this issue. What to do with the Indians? Can they become like us, or are they permanently alien to white Protestant Christian society? Let's talk about assimilation here for a moment in more detail. In an attempt to assimilate the Indians into white culture, a reservation police force is established in 1878. This police force would model assimilation. The Indian police would dress as whites and carry out white laws. They would practice monogamy. These Indians who carried out these tasks for the whites would receive guns and horses. They would broker the distribution of rations and supervise the construction of roads, irrigation ditches, make arrests if necessary, take a census if necessary. So you have Indians acting as agents for the white power on the reservations in an attempt to assimilate the Indians. Another attempt was the creation of Indian courts. These began in 1883. And it tries to establish jurisdiction over those Indian practices that are most frowned upon by the whites. The traditional Indian dances, polygamy, the medicine men. These cultural artifacts are viewed as obstacles to the government's civilization program. These new courts bring a kind of indirect rule over the Indian societies. The Bureau of Indian Affairs can govern, assimilate, or oppress, depending on your point of view, the Indians through the tribal police and through the Indian courts. A word or two about reservations. Assimilation is enhanced by confining Indians to a particular area, or at least this is the belief. If we could confine Indians to a particular area, then we can civilize them. We can have a greater impact on them on a daily basis. The Indians can be taught English on the reservations. They can be converted to Christianity. And of course, these reservations are generally located away from the traditional expansion routes westward by the white settlers or white railroads and things like that. Allotment and assimilation. Now, this allotment is an idea that's going to emerge here toward the end of the century. How can Indians become civilized if they're left on reservations, even with the Indian police, even with Indian courts? There's an attempt here in 1887 through the Dawes Act to remedy this problem. The Dawes Act is going to destroy the communal land ownership, which was typical in Indian society, and begin to impose private land ownership. The creation of private property private property is allotted to Indian head of families. These families would receive title to the land after tending to it for 25 years. Indian children could be taken from the tribal environment and re-educated at Indian boarding schools. And we see these boarding schools emerging in the eastern part of the United States, where Indian children are taken and quote-unquote civilized. Another word about these Indian boarding schools, native languages are forbidden, only English will be spoken. Traditional long hair is clipped. Children will renounce traditional Indian culture. Their dress, military uniforms for boys and Victorian dresses for girls. The Indian children are going to be given American names. And of course, there will be no religious rituals other than Christianity. Consequences of the Dawes Act. A majority of the Indian land is going to pass into the hands of the federal government. Indian loss of culture, loss of language, Indian families disrupted or destroyed. The Dawes Act is a failure in its attempt to assimilate Indians into white culture by imposing private property. Elimination, a couple of words here. Vestiges of Indian autonomy are viewed as resistance by the United States government. Any sort of Indian resistance or autonomy is viewed essentially as an internal act of war. Between the Civil War and the end of the 19th century, my statistics say that the U.S. Army was involved in more than 1,400 official actions against the Indians. Treaties with the Indians are continually broken. President Grant himself sends the U.S. Army into the Great Sioux Reservation, breaking previous treaties. And the one incident in American Indian history that most people are familiar with, of course, is that of General Custer, George Armstrong Custer, leading the 7th Cavalry into a large Indian encampment on the Little Bighorn River in the summer of 1876. This encampment is attacked by Custer's forces, and of course, Custer's unit is wiped out. It's very unusual for a military unit to be completely destroyed. Custer, therefore, has become a sort of mythological figure in U.S. history because of this. We wouldn't even know his name had he and all of his men not been killed that day. Just after the Little Bighorn, our defeat there, the United States encroached further on Indian territories. Of course, the battle at Little Bighorn would justify this. The U.S. government had another way of encroaching upon Indian land, and that is, by the late 19th century, we provided much of the food and supplies to Indian reservations, and we could simply withhold these essential supplies in order to blackmail the Indians. And then in 1890 comes the coup de grace, the massacre at Wounded Knee. Indians are forbidden here at the Pine Ridge Reservation, this is in North Dakota, from participating in their ghost dance, a ritual Indian dance. This ghost dance was an attempt to maintain Indian sovereignty, or at least the traditions of the Indian culture. To the United States Army, this looked like resistance and rebellion, and it was put down. Over 150 Indian men, women, and children are slaughtered during this massacre at Wounded Knee. Let me give you a couple of conclusions here. Indian population is dramatically decreased. in the second half of the 19th century. Most of the surviving Indians are forced onto reservations. Indianness is viewed as alien to American culture. The self-sufficiency and ecological balance that characterized the Indian tribes at the time of European settlement, this has been completely destroyed. And the Indians are forced into a station of dependency upon the U.S. government. Finally, does U.S. policy amount to genocide? Does it amount to ethnic cleansing? Is it simply the spoils of war? Is it an example of social Darwinism? These are the questions that you should contemplate when you think about the U.S. policy toward the Indians in the latter half of the 19th century. Thank you.